This is writings of Saint Paul. Saint Paul was introduced to the disciples by Saint Barnabas, and Barnabas was very well-respected disciple among them, and he was one of those who was most closely associated with Jesus and walked around the streets with him and everything. But Paul never knew Jesus in his lifetime. And then it began to appear to Barnabas shortly thereafter, after a first mission or two missions, that St. Paul was pressing this bit about Jesus being the Son of God too much and too harsh. That created a split between them. And the church plays down that split and that reason for the split, quite skillfully in fact. As soon as Jesus knocked off superstition and paganism, Paul brought it back up, and it's best described by George Bernard Shaw about how Paul erected the pagan identity of Jesus. The writing here says, Paul succeeded in stealing the image of Christ crucified for the figurehead of his salvationist vessel, with its Adam posing as the natural man, its doctrine of original sin, and its damnation avoidable only by faith in the sacrifice of the cross. In fact, no sooner had Jesus knocked over the dragon of superstition than Paul boldly set it on its legs again in the name of Jesus. It was Paul's idea that Adam's sin was unforgivable. Some people wrote in the Torah erroneously that God is unforgiving, that God is going to punish many generations by the infractions of one generation.
It's not true.
It's not consistent with God's justice. Divine justice doesn't do that. There is this idea of messianism in Christianity and in Judaism, which appears to purport that there's going to be an Armageddon and a war between the faithful and the unfaithful. Well, these are ideas that came out of St. Paul's contrived kind of thoughts. I have been able to trace this story about second coming of Jesus strictly to St. Paul. He's the one that first initiated all that, and then all the Gospels took the idea right from him, and then boom, it started propagating into everything else. These Gospels were the collections of Gospels that went with the 300 bishops, were sent to the Nicaea conference, which was called to order by Emperor Constantine to resolve a religious conflict. The emperor was very concerned about the unity of his empire. He really won what he wanted by keeping the empire unified, but the 300 bishops came up with the Trinity doctrine. Well, there were so many Gospels written after Jesus' life ended on earth here. In fact, there were hundreds of Gospels. They wanted then to see what Gospels we are going to accept at this point. So they decided to put all these Gospels in one room under the table, and they said that we're looking for a miracle here, that the Gospels that will show up on the table in the morning, in the following morning, will be the Gospels accepted. Now, nobody knows who kept the keys to the room. It's said that there was no keys to the room in anybody's hands, and that in the morning, lo and behold, those four Gospels, that is Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, showed up on top of the table, and all these other Gospels that were stayed on the ground under the table were burned in that event. And many of them were, by the way, were in Hebrew language. So if any of those could have been some of the instructions, of the early instructions of Jesus, they obviously disappeared. Fortunately, the certain copies of Barnabas' Gospel survived, including one copy of the Barnabas' Gospel that was found on his chest in his grave. He is one of the few people, Saint Barnabas, who would be considered an eyewitness to the events that happened during Jesus' life. Mark, Matthew, Luke, none of these is an eyewitness to Jesus. This man was.
Barnabas.
Yes, and it's admitted here. There's nothing secret about that. And he calls himself here, he who writeth. He was a scribe. Jesus died about 30 AD. So this means there's about a period of 3 decades by the time these were written. The people who wrote these books were anonymous individuals. It's not the same people that carry those names, that it's not the disciples that were known to have been around Jesus. And actually, all these people who studied the Bibles and wrote about who wrote the New Testament, like Professor Burton Mack, professor of early Christianity at the Claremont colleges, he has established beyond doubt now that all those four writers, the anonymous writers who wrote those Gospels, were taken from St. Paul. Professor Grant here, in this book here, he researched hundreds and hundreds of references in the Gospels, and he was trying to come to acknowledge and find who Jesus was. In his book, he says that Jesus has never called himself the Son of God. It was only Paul that labeled him such. Isaac Newton, the great mathematician and scientist, he also wrote in theology. Isaac Newton was one of those opposed to the doctrine of Trinity.
Newton called the Trinity a cult?
Yes, he calls it the cult of three equal gods as the abomination of desolation. That's what Isaac Newton was saying, that it's all one religion from the days of Noah, and the basic ideas in it was the love of God and the love of neighbor, and it was free of superstitions, free of innovation and inventions. From Noah to Abraham to Moses, Jesus, then Muhammad. It's one religion, the religion of God. Isaac Newton said in his best words. He said once, and I will never forget that, he said, the only temple of God is the universe. And he was amazed with the temple of God that he was looking at all the time in his life. He was fascinated with how accurate, precise these movements of these planets around each other and in orbits, and he called it the clockworks.